Just after World War II, the government's spending on pensions in the UK amounted to about 2% of GDP. These days, it's nearer 8%. Almost 1 in 5 of us are aged over 65, and that's expected to grow to 21% by 2027. And women have a life expectancy of 83. That's a lot of retirement to fund, and it's just going to get more expensive. Yet, pensioners aren't exactly rolling around in untold wealth, are they? So how do we fix the retirement problem? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. So a YouGov poll recently showed that almost half of all Brits doubt they're going to have enough to live on in their old age. 1/3 say they'll probably have enough to live off. It's worse, of course, amongst older people, and particularly amongst those who are divorced. In fact, 42% in total reckon they will have to take another job after retirement and reduce their living costs. Only 9% would be able to rely on support from the family. So we've got a small proportion of people who are happy about moving into old age. Those living off a state pension in the UK get a maximum of £129.20 per week. But of course, many also have a private pension or an occupational scheme that's paid for by their employer. You know, if their employer hasn't gone bankrupt in the process, which sometimes happens. And then those who have their own investment portfolio, or those who buy a big family home and expect to downsize and live off the difference. So it's a confusing picture, isn't it, Steve, as to how people fund their retirement. But what is the best way? Is it a safety net, which we sort of have with the state pension scheme? And then, of course, we're encouraging private pension schemes as well, and letting people invest it for their future. So we've got this sort of like mixed picture at the moment. Is that the best way? Obviously not, because we've got a high proportion of people saying, well, no, we're not going to have enough money in our old age.
I get to be total con job. I mean, I was part of the Accord movement back in Australia, the Hawke and Keating government process to the idea of the Accord initially was to get a sort of business and union compact, business union government compact to manage the economy more effectively. It got turned into wage restraint, partially using superannuation to make up for increases in wages, rather than getting a wage rise equivalent to the rate of inflation plus a bit. You got a wage rise less than the rate of inflation and a boost to your superannuation. The idea being that it's going to help reduce inflation in the economy, and the overall impact over time is that wage rises were less than the rate of inflation, and then you got your super, et cetera, and that looked great when people were putting money into the stock market back in 1983 when this whole thing began. And between 1983 and 1987, the amount of stock market money in Australia going into superannuation money going into the stock market went from 30% of the stock market to 70% of the stock market, or 30% of total super money to 70% of total super money. And then the stock market crash of October 1987 occurred, and the index fell by 25% in one day, and people's wonderful estimations of their future retirements went out down the gurgler. And and consequently, ever since then, the pressure's been more and more to move supporting people past working age off the state purse onto the private superannuations and so on. And they all work very well if you're wealthy, if you're earning a large amount of money, if
you know what you're doing on the stock market.
Yeah, which means ultimately it's completely failed the initial objective, which was to make sure that no matter what your standard, what your standard of living was as somebody who was working, you got enough to survive when you could no longer work. And consequently, we're seeing half the population saying they can't survive without working in what's supposed to be their retirement.
We can understand why governments want to try and get pensions off their books. If we look between about 12% of all government spending goes on state pensions. If we look between 2007 and 2012, it increased 28%, whilst GDP per capita increased by just 4.5%. Now, this is not because we're getting more pensioners. Of course, it's that we are getting more of them, and they want to see more as well, obviously. But the state pension is £129.20 a week, as I said, so it's not a great deal of money. But 12% of all government spending is going on state pensions, so it's a reasonable slug of money.
It is, but it's again, there's a sort of thing which the state should be financing, because a state that produces its own money has the capacity to run. It is not financially constrained. What you've got is, how do you actually, when you're creating government spending, what do you spend it on? And I think spending on pensioners and students is rather better than spending on armaments, for example, which is where nobody ever questions the defence budget. But the same story. This is money which is created by the government, spent into existence. It's better, I think, to give it to people like students at one end and pensioners at the other, rather than bureaucrats and rather than people building bombs. So it is a feasible way to distribute the state's money creation capacity. The issue we face is do we have the physical capacity to hand that much of the GDP over to people who are not working? And the answer should be yes, we do, because of technological change over time. We've got far more mechanisation, far more efficient energy exploiting systems. And of course, there are issues with those in the context of global warming that I'm not going to ignore. But it would be feasible to see the capacity of more machines per worker, meaning more productivity, meaning that you can support a larger non-working population. And that should be the sign of a successful society.
But it would mean a quantum leap, wouldn't it, in spending? So if we said, well, okay, everyone's... let's assume everyone's going to get a state pension. Let's forget about the fact that you invest in your own portfolio and it all gets done by the private sector, by the financial sector. It means a quantum difference, because first of all, everyone gets a state pension. There's more old people, and £129 a week is clearly not enough. So you're talking about maybe doubling the number of people getting a state pension, and then at least doubling the amount that they're getting. If you created that much extra money into the money supply, that would be inflationary, wouldn't it?
Well, yeah, and then at the same time, you have an entire industry that's grown up in supporting this stuff. The whole Australia's superannuation income industry, the finance sector. The real beneficiary of all this stuff has been the finance sector. And, I'm terribly sorry, but I think the finance sector can do with less food. So you'd have a dramatic disruption to the structure of society we've created this way as well, where an enormous amount of money is spent on people, persuading other people to put their money in this fund rather than that fund on past performance. So it's a conjure order. And I've got colleagues like Philip Seuss and Cameron back in Australia who are saying we should just abolish the superannuation industry and just go back to state pension, which are much simpler and frankly cheaper to administer. But it is a huge change, and it of course will be resisted lock, stock and barrel by the finance sector, which has made so much of its money out of manipulating what the pension payments.
Goes without saying, we're going to abolish you. How do you feel about that? No, we don't think that's a good idea. Of course, but but I mean, people are confused by it all as well.
Yeah.
How many times, you start a new job, you go into a new pension fund, you try and roll over pension funds, you forget about previous pension funds you've been in. There's terms and conditions and costs associated with each, and with each rollover, you read the product disclosure statements and don't understand it. You're paying fees that you don't understand. You don't even know what the fees are half the time. I mean, it is a complete con job.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm supposed to be accessing a pension having left the UK education system. I haven't done it yet. You've reminded me. I've got a few quid that I might need to get hold of there. But it is so complicated that people just don't have the time to work it out themselves. And of course, ultimately, when it's inadequate, as you're saying, a large number are saying I've got to work in their retirement. And I do see so many workers who are clearly my age or older doing, working in street cleaning, working on trams and stuff like that. And you think this is a failure to provide for our population as they age, which is not the sign of a healthy society.
That's for sure. And if you want to hear this discussion in full, then listen to the full podcast at debunkingeconomics.com. You'll need to subscribe there or become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen. Pledge $10 or more support to Steve's work on that site, and you'll get access to this and all the other podcasts in this series. I'm Phil Dobbie. He's Steve Keen. We'll be back again for another one soon.